Hey, Howell here. What I want to do today is talk about the the refugee crisis, but I want to talk about also the war on terror, or should we call it the war of terror? And I'm not coming at this blank. I have about 18. I had about 18 years experience of working with refugees. I just run through it very briefly, so you know. So, in 2002, roughly, I volunteered for an agency called Refugee Action. And from there, I got a job as a caseworker, and I worked with asylum seekers and refugees. I then moved on to another department called Choices, where I dealt with voluntary returns. So it was the voluntary return of appeals rights exhausted asylum seekers, and I think they called them irregular migrants, people who'd overstayed their visas and for some reason they weren't able to return. They wanted to, but they couldn't. So, let's say they were in hospital or something like that. And during this time, I was required to take basic legal advice, immigration advice, qualifications. It was called OIS Level 1, and then went on to OIS Level 2. So that was sort of basic to intermediate and working under a solicitor. And so after that, we were all made redundant, hundreds of us. And then I volunteered in the Syrian resettlement program, where I helped. I did voluntary work, and I got a job as a senior support worker. And then I basically, we were helping families, Syrian mainly families, resettle in the UK. So that's my background. So if I go back to 9/11, this is where it really explodes. But before that, you have refugees coming into the country, but it was never large enough for the media to sort of pick up on it the way it does today. And so what happened is, or for even to be noticeable, I know you had the boat people and things like that, but the situation was in 9/11. Obviously, Bin Laden and Al Qaeda were accused of it. That's the official story. But the Taliban weren't. But they were accused. They were offering land or bases to Al Qaeda. So that gave the Allies a big excuse to go into Afghanistan and find Al Qaeda and Bin Laden and bring him back, extradite him to bring him back to justice. But that's obviously going to be very disastrous. I'll explain in a minute. But if 9/11 is September, and they invade, I believe, in December, that gives Al Qaeda and Bin Laden enough time to vacate the entire country, which is what they did, more or less. And so when the Allies went in, they couldn't find Bin Laden. It would have been more common sense is to hunt them down, rather like hunting down the Nazis after the Second World War. And so the propaganda news was that the Taliban had been toppled and it's a great success there. But the truth, I mean, I knew Afghanistan, and my brother was a soldier there, that I knew it was a huge disaster. And there was a sort of quite a critical situation there. Now, when they went in, they would have known the Allies would have known that would have created a refugee crisis, because there was already a refugee crisis in the country at the time. And there had been going back to the 80s, because America and its allies were supporting just about anybody to oust out the Russians, the Soviets, the communists. So it was almost hypocritical of them to go after Taliban, despite the fact it's obvious to anybody that the Taliban is a monstrous, sexist, demonic organisation. Now, if we move on from that, you've got the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now, for me, it was who is best suited to dealing with the issue of weapons of mass destruction. Is it weapons inspectors in a relative peace zone, like Hans Blitz, Scott Ritter, David Kelly and the like, in huge, great teams? or is it in a relative peace zone, or is it soldiers, British and American soldiers, in a war zone? Well, I think the former is the safest and the cheapest option. And they could have easily have gone down. They could have easily have orchestrated that. They didn't even finish their job. And why should anybody be going to war on what if? Because the whole thing was fear, fear, fear. We were never shown any solid evidence, that there was an existential threat there. It was all one great big lie. It was all absolutely one great big lie. And it led to one of the biggest refugee crises since the Second World War. So from there's no excuse. They know that. And then after that, and don't get me wrong, it led, the Saddam Hussein government was that, it was barbaric, it was a gangster regime. But what replaced it was worse. A very, very weak government. And because it was so weak, it allowed ISIS to flow in from Syria. Now, if we move on there to Libya, they can't get away with boots on the ground again. So what they do, and they probably haven't got the resources, so what they do is they support the oppositions in Libya. And then we were supporting organisations, movements, terror cells, whatever, that were scribbling the Quran on Scud missiles and firing them off. They have no accuracy whatsoever. They are crude weapons of mass destruction. And then when the only thing they agree with is the toppling of Gaddafi. Well, when the Gaddafi regime falls, and they wouldn't have fallen if they hadn't been supported, if the opposition hadn't been supported by proxy forces, they wouldn't have fallen. It leads to two very weak governments in conflict with each other, and the road between Tripoli and Benghazi being one of the most dangerous roads in the world regarding the hostage taking, particularly children hostages, and then genocide in the south, opening up the sub-Sahara. I mean, just leading to a massive refugee crisis again. And then the same in Syria is that they support the opposition, and they lie to us by telling us it's the moderate rebels, Robin Hood and Maid Marian, when they had a tremendous, huge human rights issue, and they were never strong enough to take the country. They were never strong enough to govern that. They were never strong enough to depose if that's the right word, the Assad regime, and then run the country democratically. It's not going to happen, especially with Putin in the background, and then Putin getting involved later on. And it was the weakening, and this led to really one of the biggest refugee crises of the Second World War. Millions and millions all over Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, into Turkey, millions in Turkey, and then Europe. A terrible situation. And it was the weakening, the Free Syrian Army weakening the country, and then eventually collapsing, led to ISIS taking over. And then because Iraq is weak, they flow into Iraq. That is the result of the war on terror and a gigantic refugee crisis all across the Middle East. Now, what happens is, I want to talk about the Geneva Convention here. Well, first of all, when I worked in the Syrian resettlement scheme, I didn't come across one war wound, right? They had all escaped a proxy civil war. And I did come across some torture victims from both sides, okay? But most, as Aleppo was blowing up on our screens, when I was helping people resettle, the neighbours or people would think, oh, they're coming from that. And I thought, well, no, this family have been here for years. They've been in Turkey for years, or wherever, Jordan for years. that little one there was born in Turkey. And they're coming from towns. They weren't coming from refugee camps. And I remember this meeting where we got like quite strong with the manager saying, can we have refugees from the camps because they're the most vulnerable? But no, they were coming from the towns. And the reason they were coming from the towns, most of them, was because there was clearly an agreement between particularly the Turkish government and the powers to be, whether it be United Nations, European Union, because Turkey wanted to decrease the number of refugees in the towns. It didn't. The ones in the refugee camps weren't a concern. Weren't too much of a concern. Because the growing, well, what should we call it? Nationism, countryism, discrimination against Syrian refugees in Turkey and in Jordan was really a massive problem as well. And let me just show you how the Geneva Convention works. It's only just recently that the Geneva Convention has sort of found its way into mainstream media, because most people just haven't got a clue about it. Now, the Geneva Convention, obviously it goes back decades, and it was obviously created by bureaucrats that probably didn't know what was going to happen in years to come. But what it does is it gives you, if you're from a country that has a human rights record, right, a very poor human rights record, and you're on their blacklist, you can claim asylum in a country which is a signatory to the Geneva Convention, right? But countries like Turkey, Italy, Spain, Greece, they don't adhere to it. Particularly, they don't adhere to it very well at all. So the clients get there, and what they used to do very effectively is just travel through. And so the powers to be in those countries would just let them pass through. And so what they do is they would head to France, but particularly like Holland and Belgium and now Germany, Austria, United Kingdom, and then Scandinavia, and countries that would where you could guarantee being offered some support, because that's in the Geneva Convention. And you've also got the Human Rights Act. You've got Article 3 of the Human Rights Act, which it's European law, but it's built into UK law. I'm not sure what the situation is after Brexit. I think it's still in. It's still it's still in the immigration rules, if that's where it is. It's been a long time since I did this kind of advice, right? But and that, when I was working with Refugee Action and I gave legal advice for the Red Cross as well. When I was working in that area, people, they would talk about the United Nations and the Geneva Convention, human rights, as though it had come down from Mount Horeb with Moses or something like that, or Mount Sinai or whatever. It was, and I thought, no, men have written it. Men that can make mistakes, men that can't see the future wrote it. And I mean men, yeah? And so, and I'm all in favour. If you can see that people do need to get out, they do need to claim asylum. They do, like with Gaza, it's so obvious that people do need to get out, and they do need to. They do need some protection. But when a country is offering protection from a war that it started, people should be asking questions. People should. To me, it's just like the whole thing is madness. I thought, am I not seeing it right? But when I realised how just unbelievably politically naive most people in Refugee Action were. There was a couple of individuals, and they weren't English. It was the Iranians and the Iraqis that could see what was going on. It was really quite a shock for me. The political naivety. Emotion and no mind, continually. It was quite but if I and to this day, the Geneva Convention is the only piece of legislation that offers protection. It's the only individual. It's the only piece of international legislation that deals with human rights, as far as I know. That's what I was told. But and then if we move on to the Gaza, right? You got a unique situation there because they can't get out. The refugees can't get out. They're internally displaced. And I wonder whether the Israelis have gone into Rafah because in Rafah, they can force the border open. The reason why Egypt is not taking them on is because it knows its history of the region. It doesn't want a repetition of the 1948 Nakba and a refugee crisis in Lebanon that led, and obviously other countries, but led to the foundation of the PLO. And then the PFLP-GC and the PFLP, George Habash and the Abu Nidal group, huge destabilizing forces. And so, and that I'm sure is the reason why Egypt won't let them in. They just simply don't want a refugee crisis, and they don't want a similar situation to what they've got in Turkey. The whole thing to me is just madness. And of course, what it does is it's opened up a people smuggling racket. Now, if you do the work I've done, you know what a ghastly racket this is. If you don't destroy your passport when you get to the United Kingdom, we know where your grandmother lives. You enter the country with no documentation. And so they bring in this, I think it's Article 2. I know it's got 2. Anyway, it's about entering the country with no documentation or false documentation. And you can go to prison for it, but most people have been blackmailed by a mafia to do that, Anyway, and it's like no one in the United Nations is just looking at themselves, point the camera and say, look, this has absolutely exploded into a ghastly people smuggling racket where people are taking dangerous journeys where they're being killed. They get killed, they get raped, they get abused, they're forced into prostitution. You see all this when you do the job I do. And it's a black market, it's cash in hand. When I was working with Refugee Action, there was this guy on the pavement I saw. And there's a huge, great wad. I saw between two blokes, a massive, great wad of £50 notes. And they were all £50 notes. And I was just, what was all that about? I wonder what that was for. Did he buy a fridge off him or something? Did he? I was just so naive. Years later, I think, no, it's smuggler. The guy's a smuggler, for God's sake. He's part of the whole network. It's I don't know. It made it really difficult for me to work in that area. It really did. It made it really, really difficult because I felt like I was sort of working in madness. And I know that many of the people I worked with, they had no home. It had been bombed. There was no home to return to. And there was a need to flee the country. And it's the same in Gaza. What would you do if you were in Gaza now? And you could get out. Would you get out? Yeah. But that's not the solution. The solution, the only solution to this is at the source, the heart of the problem. and that's these mindless wars. And if people just, if you cannot see that powers to be are creating these wars, right? In a war of terror that could be avoided. Okay, you'd be left with Saddam Hussein, but to be honest with you, Saddam Hussein was no longer being monitored the way he was, and with weapons inspectors, he was no longer a danger to the region. He was a danger internally. He was still a human rights abuser. But what's replaced him is arguably worse. I mean, ISIS, most people would regard ISIS as worse. What's in Libya is arguably worse. I spoke to a Libyan the other day. He was staunchly against Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, sorry. And she said to me, you know, people in Libya are regretting it when she goes back there. And so that concludes my talk on the war on terror, or the war of terror, and the manufactured refugee crisis. When you look at the billions that it's costed, I'm just going to talk about multiculturalism and diversity before I finish. Is that there's a trope that, you know, diversity is our strength, multiculturalism is good. Well, yeah, maybe, yeah. But it depends on what you're diverse with, and it depends on what you're multicultural with. What makes up your multiculturalism? There is an existential reality of whether it's a good thing or not, and like cultures have to mix in order to survive. If you've ever been travelling in the remote areas of Yemen, like I have, and you've seen monoculturalism, where cultures have been completely isolated from the rest of the world, you can see that monoculturalism is equally as bad. But what we have is not multiculturalism because of the human being being a migratory being, and they're just exercising their freedom. But people are fleeing because of economic depravity, proxy civil wars, human rights atrocities, and people just jumping on the bandwagon. You know, people just, this seems to be a good, you know, I'll join this. But there must be some economic depravity because people don't migrate easily. So what makes up the diversity in the multiculturalism is economic depravity in Eastern Europe, and a whole load of mindless wars, and the people offering asylum and spending billions on it, on asylum seekers and refugees, are the people who created the war in the first place. It's just, if you were an alien coming from outer space, I think you just put your indicators on and turn left and bypass it all. It's I can't make sense of it. Well, the problem is I can make sense of it. That's what the problem is. And I can see it's senseless. But that concludes my talk on the war of terror and the manufactured refugee crisis, and for what. Okay, and thanks for joining me.